Well, I'm good to get going whenever you are.
Let's rock and roll. All right, so this particular subject matter is I might have said this before about human factors and decision making, but it happens to be probably the most important of all the sessions. Maybe weather's equally as important because that happens to be a factor in every flight you take. But human factors and aeronautical decision making is like you've got to have this stuff. It's extremely important. Whether or not you're good at doing this stuff, and just in your brain on your own, or if you have to put it down on paper. There's several tools that we're going to go over that the FAA suggests that you use early in your training and after you get your private pilot's license. We're going to go over some of those tools. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to do task and risk management as a single pilot, single crew resource management scenario. Most of the time you do your flying, it's just going to be either just you or you and a bunch of non-pilots or you and one non-pilot. So single crew resource management happens to be a very important aspect of aeronautical decision making. So when you actually look at the statistics, the FAA and the NTSB publish from time to time will publish general aviation accident and incident statistics. And when you look at the statistics over the past 20 to 30 years, there's a theme. Over 75% of all accidents have something in common. Actually, it's a couple things in common. First, accidents that occur happen to be extremely preventable. A very large percentage of accidents happen to be preventable in nature. And there's a single common factor that you can always circle back to when it comes to general aviation accidents, and that is human-caused error. In different contexts, of course. And you might have heard it before in the news, or whenever there's a notable aircraft accident, they always kind of talk about, well, there were these 3 or 4 factors, but at the end of the day, it was really the pilot's decision making or the pilot's actions that led to the root cause. And if you look at some of the details, for instance, in this report that was issued, I think this was actually issued in 2009, but it incorporated data for a 20-year period. And this is just a Pareto of Part 91. So Part 91 meaning, general aviation, non-airline, non-commuter, business jet type activity, single engine, fatal accidents. And you can just see the list. The Pareto list here is all things that we can more or less control, or is more or less within our control as pilot in command. Failure to maintain adequate flying speed, controlled flight into terrain, adverse weather, failure to avoid objects or obstructions, mid-air collisions, stuff like that. So, the one thing you don't necessarily see on here, at least high up in the Pareto chart, is, engine failure, plane fell apart randomly. It's all controllable items, preventable items. And so, the most common question that comes out of looking at something like this is, well, why? Why would somebody or a pilot, assumedly who's well trained, because the regulations are somewhat stiff when it comes to training. Like you just mentioned, you're flying 3 to 4 times a week for a 6-month period to get your certificate. At that point, why, for someone that goes through that kind of training, why would they all of a sudden become a statistic? So the FAA and the NTSB for the past 30 years has not only published reports, but has made significant efforts, significant attempts to study these causal relationships, and but both from a psychological standpoint and from a training standpoint. And some of the material that's going to follow here in the charts is the output of those activities. You probably read there's an entire chapter of this dedicated in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and there truly is a lot of work that goes into this.
Yeah, it's the last chapter of the book. It's chapter 17. It's all about the medical and human factors. But just a side note, based upon Chris's comment from last time, will you make sure that your little icon at the bottom has the white border around it so that when I talk, it doesn't flip the screen off?
Yeah, is that, I have it on now. Is it working for you?
Oh yeah, I selected on my end. I just knew you had to select it on yours as well.
Yeah.
In case she watches this later, I was going to.
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, good point there.
Cool.
Okay. So let's dive into aeronautical decision making a little bit deeper. ADM, aeronautical decision making, is really encompasses the behavior a pilot has around two topics, two definable items. One being risk, and the other being hazard. So risk, the way I like to think about it is, risks are always present. There's always risks in everything we do in flying. And hazards tend to be the items that pop up that they were a risk and now they happen to be a hazard. For instance, the weather. Weather is always a risk. Forecasts may not be correct, but are they so incorrect, or did you do your planning to such an extent that they transform from a risk into a hazard? Now there's something you actually have to deal with. Key elements of aeronautical decision making is actually the decision making that the pilot makes, so human decision making, the attitude that the pilot has, so whether that be a character trait of theirs, or maybe it's just the type of day they're having, but the influence that somebody's attitude has affects their aeronautical decision making. And then the final element is the ability to identify and mitigate risks that occur within the flight planning envelope, or within the flight itself. Like I said before, there's always going to be risks associated with every flight. I mean, like I'm looking out the window right now. From a weather perspective, I wouldn't call it a very risky day to go flying, but depending on where you're going and what the weather forecasting looks like, it might be a different story. Something else may be more risky than the weather on a day like today. It just depends. And the FAA and the NTSB start from the highest level on aeronautical decision making and say there's a 6-step process to being successful at your aeronautical decision making, and they kind of base the context on pilot attitude, but it really can go for any type of decision making. Identify personal attitudes hazardous to flight, or more generically, identify hazards to the flight. Learn behavior modification techniques. And there is a list of what they call attitude or decision antidotes that we'll go over here in a second. You might have read about it in that chapter. Learn how to recognize and cope with stress. Develop risk assessment skills. Use all available resources, and I put passengers here because that's one that we don't typically think of. And evaluate the effectiveness of your decision making on a routine basis. What I like to do to that last point there, a lot of times when there's a go, no-go decision to be made, typically due to weather, I like to look at the weather as it takes place. So for instance, if I say, you know what, I'm not going flying today because the weather's kind of crappy, or it's great here, but it's going to be bad where I'm going, then I've made that decision. And it's great. I go about my day doing something else, but I consistently evaluate that decision by looking at some of the weather reports and determining if my decision was a good one or not. I mean, the decision not to go is always a good one, but it not only kind of reinforces your decision-making process, but it helps you become comfortable in that particular context with the weather forecasting tools and your ability to make a go, no-go decision based on what they tell you before it actually happens. So I think a lot of what you'll see with decision-making centers around weather and flight planning, happens to be a significant theme, and it's not a mistake. It also happens to be one of the higher causes of general aviation accidents is poor weather planning, flight into instrument conditions. As it concerns the attitude context, it's interesting because depending on what kind of person you are, I think this list of hazardous attitudes may have more meaning or may not have much meaning at all. But it's in the FAA and NTSB's significant time of studying pilots and people who are involved in aircraft accidents. They have consolidated this 5 characteristic list of the person who gets into an aircraft accident. And not only that, but they go one step further and say, hey, here, if you find yourself in this kind of situation, here is what you should tell yourself after you've identified that you carry this kind of characteristic or attitude. Here's what you should tell yourself to begin the risk mitigation process, so to speak. And the reason I wanted to go over these is, you know, they are helpful, number one. Number two, they're tested for, so you're going to have to know these for your test. And although, I mean, knowing you're a pretty level-headed guy. Same with myself. It's always good to kind of look at these, know they're out there, because you never know when you're going to get caught up in something like this. High-stress situations occur in the flying world, and sometimes you catch yourself kind of going in the direction of one of these hazardous attitudes. You just never know. And just to go through a couple examples, the way you'll see it on the test is they'll ask you what the correct antidote. So over here in green, I probably should have labeled it, but over here in green, I've got the antidotes for the particular hazardous attitude. So if you've got a anti-authority attitude, meaning you're not easily told what to do, you need to tell yourself to follow the rules because the rules are there for a reason. They're usually right. And then, you know, you can go down this list here and see the different characteristic traits of hazardous attitudes, and the proper, you know, call it self-coaching that you give yourself to try to avoid any sort of poor decision making as a result of the attitude itself. So I personally can't think of a time when I've had to, you know, speak myself out on one of these hazardous attitudes. But, you know, depending on what kind of situation you get into, it's good to know that at least you can have a process for getting yourself in the right mindset. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that risk is present in all aspects of the flight envelope. And we talked just a little bit about risks that the pilot presents to him or herself by way of their character traits or attitude. It's not just those particular attitudes that present risk in the flight. It's you know, technical items that present risk, flight planning items that present risk, passengers present risk. The reason that you need to get from point A to point B might be a risk. And you just have to be well equipped to handle any risk scenario that comes up. I put a couple examples here just from my own experience, but there's easy risk decisions and there's not easy risk decisions. An example of an easy risk decision is you're flying along during your cross country and you've got squall-lined thunderstorms developing straight ahead. That is an easy, there's an easy decision that goes with that risk. It's land your airplane. As opposed to maybe more difficult risk decision where, maybe it's not, the risk doesn't seem too severe or too significant. The consequences may not be too bad on the surface, but maybe it's a question of personal minimums, like, marginal VFR conditions at your departure airport and 50% chance of VFR conditions at your destination. Well, there's a lot of variables in your weather forecast, time, cloud ceilings, that sort of thing. And so those decisions aren't so easy. You can mitigate risks within that decision by having a backup plan, but it can be quite difficult. And pile on top of that, maybe you actually have to get somewhere. Maybe it's a priority. Maybe you have a business meeting to go to, or maybe you've got a funeral to attend or something like that. So from a risk perspective, it's all around us throughout the whole flight. You'll be able to identify risk about every aspect of a flight. And right off the bat, there is a tool that is published by the FAA. It's in the pilot's aeronautical knowledge handbook. And I don't know what your feedback is on that particular chapter, but when I studied this and when I've been going back through this section to prepare for the session, I think the tools that the FAA present regarding aeronautical decision making happen to be kind of just piled into a chapter. There's not a lot of good direction on how to use the tools, except that there's several tools to use and kind of get cozy with one that works for you type thing. But right off the bat, there is a risk tool called the PAVE tool that I think is extremely handy, especially when it comes to flight planning and getting familiar with identifying potential risk scenarios with your flight. And the PAVE tool is an acronym. P is the pilot, A is the aircraft, V is the environment, and E is external pressure. And so in your flight planning, it's very helpful to literally write this out and list some elements of risk that come into play for your flight. Some of them will end up on every single flight you do. Others will come up depending on where you're flying or what kind of day, whether you're flying at day or at nighttime. But let me go through each one just real quickly. The pilot, the P, pilot in command. This is an easy one. There is a I'm safe checklist that you can use to help identify any risks for the pilot, him or herself. Have you seen the I'm safe checklist before?
I have. It was in one of the videos I have to watch for the Cessna pilot school thing.
Oh, perfect. Good. So right off the bat, you can do the I'm safe checklist to identify any risks that that may exist for the pilot. Aircraft is next. So what risks or limitations or what is unique about the airplane that you're flying today that might present some sort of issue for your flight? Now, it's kind of, when you're doing your flight training, it's like, well, I fly the same plane every time. So, and it's a training aircraft, so it's taken care of. I'm very familiar with it. And that's all well and good. But it just depends on what kind of flight you're doing. Typically on training flights, you're sticking around the airport. You're going to the training area. When you start doing your cross countries, well, you have to start thinking about Well, what's my aircraft's navigation capability? How much fuel does it hold? You know, stuff like that. So you got to think about those kind of things. Is it certified for IFR flight, or is it only VFR? Those kind of things. V environment. So this is the one that I think probably changes the most out of the PAVE checklist each time you go flying, because predominantly because of weather. What does my weather situation look like? And then E, you've got external pressure. This one also tends to be different depending on what flight you're taking. Now, if you're doing a joyride or you're going for a $100 hamburger, maybe, you know, it's not going to be so significant. But if you're going from point A to point B and you need to get somewhere, and it's going to cost you $1,000 to buy an airline ticket, so you're definitely going to have to fly your own plane, well then, you know, all of a sudden external pressure enters the risk matrix. So the PAVE tool, I think, is a good one. It's 4 simple, you know, self checks to ensure that you've covered the ground on potential risks for your flight. Now, the FAA will tell you that there's a bunch of other tools that you can use too. I'm going to go over those here in a couple charts, so I want to cover them. But PAVE is one that I think is a good one to know for your training and to know for your check ride. I would think that your examiner would be very happy to see that you understand how to use the PAVE tool. So here's I'm safe, and you know about this one. I actually didn't know. What's funny is I didn't know about the I'm safe checklist until several years ago. So I don't know if it wasn't around when I got my ticket, but it's definitely a good one, I think, especially since you know, when you fly from point A to point B, chances are you're flying back to point A the next day. Maybe you went to a party the night before. You know, did you sleep well enough? You know, stuff like that. So this is a good one. This is definitely a good one. I would know how to use this one too throughout your training and for your check ride. And then this was interesting. I actually, I'm not sure if this was in the literature, in the text or not, but I found this bulleted list of items, distinct, quote unquote, distinct traits that the NTSB and the FAA had come to finalize based on their accident investigations dating back to several years ago. So I wanted to put this on a chart. I found it to be interesting. Pilots prone to accidents have 5 distinct traits, and I guess none of these are, you know, these are all extremely obvious, right? It's you really don't want to, or we don't want to fall into any of these categories at all. So I think so long as you can confidently say that you wouldn't find yourself on this page, it's a pretty good thing. I've met some pilots who fall into the number 3 category, and I've met some pilots who I think fall into the number 5 category. And it's just, you know, people get comfortable and they are maybe trying to impress somebody or somebody's and get into trouble. I think one of the good things about you wanting to get your IFR ticket relatively quickly after getting your private pilot certificate is that particular training and certificate will teach you procedures and how to, you know, it takes the VFR flying world and amplifies it procedurally and makes you stick to a certain protocol of flying, which I think not only makes you a better pilot, but makes you realize that there's a lot of consequences for not sticking to the rules. All right, so here is just kind of a high level, just very simple flow chart, and this is how the FAA has laid out their decision-making process. They've got a handful of tools. When you did your reading, were you kind of like me? It's like you you read the chapter and you're like, wow, there's so many freaking tools. Like, which one do I start with?
Yeah, and how am I going to remember all these acronyms?
Yeah, it's kind of a joke, actually. But I've come to realize that there is maybe a more popular method of executing on this flow chart and utilizing a set of tools. I will be interested to see if your instructor actually has a different or similar opinion of how the tools are used. At the end of the day, here's just the God honest truth. You're not going to have the time if a hazard presents itself in flight. You're not going to have the time to whip out a piece of paper and start doing the decide checklist, right? It's just not going to happen, unfortunately. And so, you know, I personally find it very useful to be ready with pre-flight planning, like the PAVE checklist for pre-flight planning. I think is a good one. And then if you feel that you need to actually write out some of these other tools as a pre-flight, it's not a bad idea. But executing any of these in flight, that's tough. So, but let's go through some of these. I'll explain some of the methodology that I think you know, is popular that I use, and then we're going to actually watch a video and talk about some of these tools, which I think will be. I think looking at a practical application is probably a good way to do this. And by the way, we're gonna focus on it from the perspective of the single pilot. The FAA spent a lot of time documenting what they call single pilot resource management, SRM, and it's important primarily because when you do your flying, you're either going to be solo in the cockpit or you're going to be flying with a non-pilot or non-pilots. Or even if the person you're flying with is a pilot, it's not like you may not be used to flying with that person. So you and the other pilot may not have a standard protocol for who's doing what. So the FAA has published the 5 variables that impact single pilot resource management. And during the decision-making process may force that person to make a critical decision. And the 5 variables can be boiled down to 5 P's: the plan, the plane, the pilot, the passengers, and the programming. And so the first thing that you should think of when it comes to making decisions in a single pilot scenario, you should think of the 5 P's. And like I said before, you are not going to be able to do this in flight. You know, the FAA may say, well, the 5 P's, they take place in flight, but you're not going to be able to sit there, whip out a piece of paper and say, okay, well, let me think of the 5 P's while we're flying here. Now, this is something that you're really, if you want to do it, are going to have to do from a pre-flight perspective. Every pilot does this, whether they know it or not. Some just find it extremely helpful to do it in writing, and I don't think it's a bad idea at all. So when you're doing your pre-flight planning, say you're doing a cross country, it is not a bad idea to whip out a piece of paper and write down the 5 P's and maybe jot down a few of your thoughts on risks associated with these particular elements of the flight planning. So the plan, we're going to step through each of them. So the plan is just that. It's the actual flight planning. It's the mission profile. What is your flight? Is it a simple training flight into the practice area, or is it a complex multi-stop cross country that's going to take you through various weather patterns, day and night, fuel stops, you name it, right? So what kind of risks are present in your particular plan that you're going to have to think about and potentially mitigate, okay? Are you going to be flying, is it a multi-leg cross country where you're flying through a cold front that could have potentially squall line thunderstorms? That kind of risk mitigation is going to have different elements to it than, your next flight your next flight training flight next weekend, right? Very, very different mission profiles. The next P is the plane. Well, what kind of shape is the plane in? When was its last inspection? Is it airworthy? Do you guys use squawk sheets at your flight school?
Yeah. Whenever they dispatch a plane, in the back is a sheet for the squawk sheets.
There you go. So what does the squawk sheet say, right? Even though the squawk, like this one I copied off of Google here, it looks like it's got a whole bunch of stuff on it. But I mean, it may or may not impact the mission profile, right? Good example right now, if someone were to do the 5 Ps on a flight with my airplane right now, they would find out that they can't fly at night because the landing light doesn't work. It's inoperable. So if they were going to be flying at night, that would be a significant hurdle to overcome from a risk perspective. They would have to be comfortable landing on a runway without a landing light, which I certainly wouldn't suggest. So, what kind of risks are present in the plane? Does the plane have a glass cockpit? Does it have a G1000 cockpit? And what is that, those capabilities obviously make the aircraft more capable, but me as a pilot, am I capable of flying with that kind of technology? Do I know how to use it? Remember that point, because the video we're going to watch, that actually comes up. That actually is a part of the 5 Ps for that particular video. And then we've got the pilot and the passengers. So the pilot, that's an easy one. That's I'm safe checklist. And then the passengers, the passengers actually introduce a unique, or could introduce a unique aspect of risk. Maybe they've never been flying in a small plane before. Or maybe you're shuttling someone to an airport to catch an airline flight, and maybe they have to make that flight. Maybe they called you the night before and said, hey, Alan, listen, I really need to make my flight tomorrow. Can we leave an hour earlier? And maybe the weather's not going to be good an hour earlier, right? So now you've got to deal with that. Or, passengers, I put this picture of the sterile cockpit. Passengers love to talk. They love to tell you how cool it is that they're going flying. Well, when you're operating around a controlled airport, there's risk to that, because, you have to be able to communicate with air traffic control. So what are you going to do to mitigate the risk of passengers talking to you during your flight in and out of the terminal area? There's certain elements of that you have to keep in mind. And then finally, we've got the programming. And the way that the textbooks describe this aspect of the 5 Ps is kind of like high technology. But the way I like to think of it is, well, the equipment in the aircraft, what kind of risks or what kind of scenarios am I going to have to think of or mitigate during my flight? How is the actual equipment itself going to present any issues to my flight? Not just high technology. I mean, the textbooks make it sound like it's GPS, GPS technology. How's that going to present risks? But it's not just that. It's any equipment, in my mind, in the aircraft. How's that going to present risk to my flight? If I do have a GPS, do I have backup paper charts in case that technology fails? Am I going to carry 2 iPads? I mean, some pilots out there carry an iPad and an iPhone with ForeFlight on it, so that if one fails, they still have the other. At the end of the day, if you're making a long cross country and you've got a G1000 cockpit, if that fails, what's your backup plan? Are you going to carry paper charts? Are you going to have something with you that'll help you? You really got to think of the worst case scenario in these things. When you start your instrument flight training, it becomes even more important, because a failure of your programming, a failure of your instruments or your equipment could mean something totally different than if it was in visual conditions. So always be ready to mitigate risks associated with the programming, with the flight equipment. So I've got a real life example I want to go through. Before we do that, does that the 5 Ps, does that kind of ring true? Do you understand how that might help you in your pre-flight planning to actually write some of that stuff out?
I do, and an interesting analog, and maybe you've done this as well, even just in my career world, you know, you go to start a project, one of the things you do at the beginning of the project and even throughout the project is you're constantly looking for the potential risks to the project. So this sort of fits with that professional experience of mine as well, so I completely understand it.
Yeah, that's a real good point, actually. Yeah, that's like one of the big steps in project management, isn't it? Identifying where things are going to go wrong.
Exactly.
So I'm gonna walk through a real life example, and I think, you know, some of this stuff is unless you experience it in person or hear someone tell a story, you know, that kind of helps ground some of the topic a little bit. So let's walk through this example. This was a year ago in November. Year ago, maybe it was 2 years ago actually. I had my family was in town, and my sister and her best friend flew in because Emily, my sister, and I were running in the Fort Worth Half Marathon. And so everybody was in town. My parents drove their van down to watch, and it was great. Well, Sunday, after the marathon, we were going to go flying. My father, who loves to fly, you know, he obviously, since I don't live at home anymore, doesn't get to fly that much. And my sister hasn't been flying that much with me, but she enjoys it. And her friend had never been flying before, ever, in a small airplane.
Wow.
So this is going to be like a first experience for her. So she was extremely excited. And so I was in a flying club, and I might have told you this story before. I was in a flying club that had, unfortunately, had questionable equipment. And I've got it up here on the screen. This particular aircraft is a Piper Cherokee. It was a PA-28 235. So it had it was like a Piper Cherokee with a souped up engine. It had a 235 horsepower engine. This thing freaking moved. It was awesome. It flew at like 160 miles an hour. It was awesome.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was nuts. But it just was not kept well. You know, notably avionics wise, it had terrible avionics. It had the bare minimum IFR required equipment, and half the items on the panel were inoperative. I mean, it had distance measuring equipment that was inoperative. Both COM2 and NAV2 were inoperative. It had a wing leveler autopilot that was inoperative. Its turn coordinator was inoperative. It was just unbelievable, right? And so I just say that to kind of give you a feel for like the owner of this airplane just was terrible, right? And notably, I've got in the red arrow over there, at the time of the flight, the COM button, the trigger that lets you talk on the comms, was inoperative. So on the squawk sheet, to rectify this situation, the owner had put a jerry-rigged COM trigger, and he tie wrapped it to the yoke.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and so essentially what that required, I won't get too detailed, but it was kind of a jerry-rigged trigger that you plugged your the speaking portion of your headset into one of the two jacks. And so your listening portion would be plugged into the normal jack into the panel, but the speaking portion was plugged into this jerry-rigged piece of crap trigger. So anyway, so I saw that on the squawk sheet, and I kind of made a mental note, like, okay, well, I better make sure I plug that in right, or I get that working right. You know, I don't want to end up in the air without comms, right? So here we go. I'm going into my 5 Ps here, and I did not do a 5 P, by the way, on paper, which got me into trouble. Okay, I did it in my head, which got me into trouble. So okay, here's the plan. What's the mission profile look like? Well, sister, dad, and friend going up for a joyride. We're just going class G. I'm not going into any Any controlled airports, just Class G flying. Dad loves to fly. Friend has never been flying. The plane is IFR certified. However, many of the avionics are inoperative. So take a mental note there. We've got a jerry-rigged comm transmit button set up. I put that in red because that would get me in trouble eventually here. So I kind of made a mental note. It wasn't going to ground us. We were still going flying, but I took a mental note. I was going to have to make sure I used that properly. The pilot, you know, all good there. I passed the I'm safe checklist. Passengers, you know, of course, my dad's been flying, my sister's been flying. We're all good there, assumedly. Our fourth passenger, you know, might have been nervous. She didn't look nervous. Of course, I'm a very careful pilot, so I want to make sure she's comfortable and check in with her, make sure she's got all her questions answered and all that, give her a good flight briefing. But that, you know, that could be a risk, so I take a mental note. And then from a programming perspective, there's no GPS in the plane. The nav worked, but it didn't work well. So when I fly this plane, and again, this is just a mental note, I didn't write this down on paper or anything, but when I fly this plane, it's VFR only. I don't fly in the clouds. We don't do IFR. It's only VFR because this plane, in my opinion, has a significantly high risk of systems failures. So if I become a heavy glider, it's not going to be in instrument conditions. It's going to be in VFR conditions. So now, now I mentioned earlier, I take a mental note of that comm transmit button set up, but I didn't, you know, no significant planning came out of that. I just take a mental note to make sure to hook it up properly, and that's it. So from a 5P perspective, let me just summarize real quick. What are the 5 Ps telling me? Okay, so my plan, my mission profile makes sense. You know, I've got just a pretty typical mission profile, and it fits the category of joyride. Okay, I'm flying an IFR certified aircraft, but I would never fly it in IFR because of our inoperative avionics situation. So what does that mean? I'm flying from a Class G airport to another Class G airport where I don't have to mix up with jets. I don't have to mix up with too many other airplanes. I'm not flying this airplane into a controlled airfield because the avionics are no good. It's simply it's a joyride aircraft. No issues with the pilot. Going to keep my eye on passenger number 4 just in case. And again, strictly VFR. So my mental 5P checklist has basically come out to say I'm taking a joyride. We're not flying in the clouds, VFR only. Oh, by the way, mental note for my comm issue here. And what ended up happening, just to kind of round out the story a little bit, we get up in the air. And I'm talking the whole time. You know, I'm doing all my communications, not at non-towered airport communications, which you will have a chance to learn when you fly out to a non-towered airport. And we get to our destination airport, which is maybe 20 miles away. It's not far. I mean, this is just a joyride. We get into the pattern, and I have a helicopter who is taking off from the airport. And so I do a self-announce. I say, all right, you know, November 1, 2, 3, 4, we're inbound from the east, 5 miles, full stop landing, runway 18. You know, helicopter, I have you in sight. Like I heard you, I have you in sight, we're all good. Well, the helicopter didn't respond. And so I'm like, all right, well, he doesn't have to respond. So I'm like, okay, well, I self-announce, we're good there. We enter downwind. Meanwhile, helicopter's taking off. He taxis to the takeoff area. He did a self-announced taxiway takeoff, which helicopters can do. And so he's airborne. So I'm coming around I'm on downwind, and I'm about to plan my base leg, and I'm like, well, you know, that he's close. Like he just took off, but he's kind of going to be in my way unless he does something quick. Like unless he gets up and starts moving. At this point, he's just hovering there around the taxiway runway intersection. So I self-announce again. I say, hey, November 1, 2, 3, 4, we're, you know, turning base, helicopter, what's your plan, buddy? You know? And no response. So I'm like, well, this is, you know, what's going on here? So I turn base, and I'm about to turn final, and I'm like, you know what? I don't think anybody can hear me. So I look down at my setup, my comm setup, and I realized that I totally forgot about our jerry-rigged comms setup, and I had plugged my transmit headset jack or plug into the aircraft jack, when I should have plugged it into the auxiliary jerry-rigged comm transmit jack. So I'm talking, but I'm not transmitting. No one hears me. Okay. Hence why the helicopter didn't hear me. The helicopter probably has no clue that there's an airplane coming in to land. So long story short, so I peel out, I cancel my approach, I head back out to an area that is safe for me to troubleshoot my issue. I get it handled, I get it set up properly, and then I head back to the airport for landing. So that is one way how you can do a 5P mentally and screw it up. Okay. What do you think? What do you think about this? I don't know what your instructor has you doing here. It's very early in your flight training, but what do you think is one thing that I could have done from a risk mitigation standpoint prior to actually taking off to ensure that I had everything that my mental note had turned into proper execution on the comm setup?
Well, like I said, one, you could have written it down and then done a check to make sure you were plugged in the right place. The second thing is, if there was an opportunity to do a radio test with any other aircraft in the Class G airspace, just to see if someone's picking you up.
Oh man, that is spot on right there, 100%. I didn't know if that would register for you since you're at a controlled airfield. Usually the radio check happens naturally, right, when you request taxi clearance.
Yeah, well, there are two landing strips nearby the airport that they use for practicing landings, and we actually went down on one. It's the smallest paved runway I've ever seen. It was so narrow. It's T54 if you ever want to take a look at it. It's called Lane Park, and so we went down that, and what was surprising is it's used by crop dusters.
Oh yeah.
But we didn't announce it, which I thought was strange. But yeah, there's another one not far from there either that's called Happy Landings. I think it's the one to, where is it? It's in this area. I think it's south of there, to be honest. I think it's, I have it written in my notes. Hold on. It's
okay.
Yeah, the airport code is 2H5 or S.
Oh, it must be a private.
Yeah, it's somewhere down in that area. It's a little grass strip, I think.
Okay. Okay. So you guys do some grass landings already, huh?
Oh no, not. We haven't. The Lane Park is paved, but my instructor was telling me about this other one.
Okay.
That they used for emergency, if they had to make an emergency landing. But yeah, so we have already visited a non-towered airport, an uncontrolled airport.
Oh, good. Okay, so you understand. So your point is spot on. Then I mean, you know, and I did that when I learned to fly. This is why I have to slap myself, because when I learned to fly, every time I got in the plane, you do a radio check, and I didn't do a radio check on this flight. And the first opportunity I had to do a radio check, it you know, could have landed me a lot of trouble, right?
Oh yeah.
So this is just why, to your point, write it down and then do something about it, right? I only did one half of I really only did one half of the decision-making process. I mentally did it at that. I didn't take any action on my 5P. So that's just a real life example of how this could have helped me quite a bit. The textbook is going to throw at you various other tools, and the way I'm going to explain it is I think the best way to attempt at executing on these tools, because you will want to execute on them during your training and obviously during your flight test. But in quick summary, they've got what's called the 3P model. And then they've got these three other tools. One we've already talked about, PAVE, CARE, and TEAM. And the PAVE, CARE, and TEAM are actually microcosms or extensions, if you will, of the 3P model. The PAVE checklist is the first step of the 3P. It's the perceive step. The CARE is the second, or the process step, and the TEAM is the last, or the perform step. The 3P model essentially is a systematic way to understand what risks or hazards are present, do some mental homework on what the consequences or what the outcomes are going to be, and then finally pick your way through that and choose an action, perform an action. And so you can, I see this two ways. You can, resort to the 3P model for your risk planning and your risk execution, your risk mitigation execution, and leave it at that. Or you can actually go the extra step and do these checklists to help you through each step of the 3P model. And I mean, you'll have to, really, the best thing to do is check with your instructor, see what they suggest, because your instructor is the one who has a relationship with the flight examiner, and they're going to get you in the best shape for the flight exam. What you actually become comfortable with in your day-to-day flying is really up to you. The 3P model for me is kind of a mental thing, but it doesn't hurt, like you said earlier, to go through these individual checklists and write things down. It really, really doesn't hurt, especially if you're doing like a complex multi-leg cross country. I think to actually write some of these things down is not a bad thing. So we went through PAVE already, which I think is an excellent written tool for pre-flight planning. The CARE and the TEAM checklists are, I would say, other tools that you can write things down with. But the downside to CARE, to writing, to really getting CARE and TEAM checklists on paper, is it kind of assumes that you've run into some hazards, right? Like, for instance, in the 3P model, if you run into poor weather planning, for instance, and you have thunderstorms along your route of flight, well, all of a sudden, in the first step of the 3P, you've got a set of circumstances in front of you. You've got your thunderstorms, for example, right? The second step requires you to process that information and their consequences or impact on your flight, right? Well, I might be able to fly around them. And then, I might, what's the consequence of that? Well, I might get some wind shear or some turbulence. We've got the option of landing and waiting it out. Well, what are the consequences of that? Well, I'm late for my funeral, or I'm late for my business meeting. All sorts of things enter. And then the problem with, so my point being, the problem with writing down the CARE and the TEAM checklist is you kind of have to assume that something's happened, or so I prefer, if using the CARE and TEAM checklists, that's a cockpit tool, and it's as simple as just having these steps written out. Just having these steps written out and being able to run through them in the event that you have an issue, which I think you're already learning early in your training. You really don't have a lot of time to run through mental checklists, right? Yeah. when things go wrong. So, but really quickly, the CARE checklist, consequences. What are the consequences of the circumstance? Are there alternatives for me to consider? So using the thunderstorm example, can I fly around it? Is it, can I actually, with the help of air traffic control, fly around thunderstorms? Can I land? Are there airports to land at? We've got the reality step of the CARE checklist. Okay, if I try to fly around it, what's really going to happen? Are there thunderstorms behind it? Could I get myself into a situation I can't get out of? And then external factors, which we've kind of already talked about. Hey, the funeral starts at 2, or the business meeting starts at 1:30. You know, so you mentally, or if you can, in writing, kind of write out what steps are you're going through in your head from a, you know, impact to my flight standpoint, or impact to, you know, external issues like where I'm trying to get to. And then the team checklist, once you've perceived your hazard, or your, you know, your risk is coming true, once that circumstance is perceived and you've processed its impact on the flight, well, then the team checklist allows you to perform risk management by dealing with each of these factors. And at the end, you should be able to make a sound decision, which is a good decision. You know, can I transfer the risk? We're actually going to see this in one of the videos, actually a video that I'm going to send after class that you can watch. Pilot gets into a lot of trouble with weather, and then they ask air traffic control. They say, hey, air traffic control, help me find an airport. Well, you just basically transferred that to somebody. You transfer that decision making to somebody else. And what does that help you do? It helps you multitask. It helps you, you know, pay attention to the flying. You know, where am I going? Now I've got someone else helping me find an airport to land at. You know, I'm going to focus on flying the airplane. Can you, in your decision-making process, in your execution and perform step, can you eliminate the risk? You know what? I've got thunderstorms ahead of me. I'm going to completely eliminate the risk. I'm going to land the airplane right now. I'm going to land the airplane. I'm going to put it in a hangar. I'm going to go stare at a weather radar screen for the next 3 hours and wait for this thing to pass. In that case, you've completely eliminated the risk. You are completely safe. Maybe you're going to accept the risk. You know what? I've been through thunderstorms before, and I've decided that I am capable and my aircraft is capable, and I'm going to accept the risk and fly through them. Or maybe you're going to mitigate the risk, and this one typically is what happens most. You're going to find a way to mitigate the risk. I am going to try to circumnavigate the thunderstorm best of my capabilities, but I'm going to stay at all times 20 miles away from the nearest radar return. And if I cannot do that, then I'm going to land at this airport. So you haven't made the decision to just land and eliminate the risk, but you've mitigated it by saying, I'm not going to fly anywhere closer than 20 miles. Oh, and by the way, I have identified an airport around the circumnavigation path for which, if I'm unable to stay 20 miles away, I'm going to land the airplane. So you can see, you know, this typically is a very smart method, and the mitigation method of the team checklist is usually the way people go. So from an application standpoint, what you might do, like I said, I don't think it's very useful to go through all this in writing in your cockpit as issues come up, but you might just maybe write down the checklist as a mental way to go through it if you are if you come into a hazardous situation. Make sense?
It does.
And there's one more, which I don't think it'd be a complete lesson if I didn't mention it, but it is one that I don't use personally, but it might work for you if you think, you know, if you go through it and like, you know what, this is a lot easier than PAVE and 3P method. You've got the decide model, and you just walk through the checklist in the context of the circumstance that you're in. You know, in the thunderstorm example, you know, detect, well, that's easy. You detect the fact that you've had a change to your weather flight planning. Estimate, you know, you estimate the need to make a change to your flight path based on the fact that you now have new weather forecasting in front of you. You make a positive decision in the choose step. Say, hey, I want a desirable outcome, right? Of course, you want to get to point B, but now you've had a hazard, or you've had a risk actually come true. So what's a positive, desirable outcome? Well, you know, being alive would be a very desirable outcome. And, you know, maybe getting as close as I can to point B would be a desirable outcome. And then you identify the actions that would get you to that desirable outcome. Okay, well, the action might be, I'm going to try to circumnavigate it, but I'm going to be comfortable with landing at an alternate airport if I cannot circumnavigate it to a 20-mile radius or a 30-mile radius. And then you take the necessary action and you evaluate that decision. This step is actually extremely important. And I do this step regardless of which model I use. Like I told you earlier, if I decide not to go flying because of weather, I basically look at the weather the rest of the day to just kind of evaluate that decision I made. Like, hey, I feel pretty good about that decision because there's like tornadoes over there and, you know, X, Y, Z. So I think even though I don't use the decide model, I use the evaluate step to kind of make sure that the decision I made was a good one. Okay, let's do a quick time check. We're actually really good on time. Let's do a video because I think it's going to provide some good dialogue. So I just ping this to you in the chat screen, okay?
Got it.
Let's go offline real quick and watch this. It's about 15 minutes long. So around the 2:30 point, why don't you just cut, when you come off mute, I'll know that you're finished watching it and we can have a dialogue.
Okay, cool. We'll do.
See you in a minute.
All right. I'm back.
All right, man. Pretty interesting, huh?
Yeah, I actually watched that video before.
Oh, okay. Was it from me?
It was some of the other videos you sent. They always had like recommended next videos.
Oh yeah.
It was one of those days where I kind of followed a few recommendations and fell on that one. I have a weird thing. I like watching videos and shows about airplane disasters because I always want to know like what's happening and why.
Oh yeah. No, I mean it's a good way to learn. You know.
Yeah.
It's obviously unfortunate for those involved, but it really helps because this stuff, unless you apply it or learn from others, it's really tough to pick up and use right away.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously weather was a big factor in this one. Do you know, and it's tough to speculate based on the air traffic control recordings, you know, what kind of pilot this guy was, or what kind of person he was. But what do you think? I mean, if he would have done a paved checklist, if he would have actually written something down, he might not have gone flying, probably for the weather, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm kind of conservative when it comes to that. I just don't see the reason to take certain risks.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a tough decision because on one hand, you want to be conservative and you want to set personal minimums, but on the other hand, at least what you'll find by your decision making is you do have to learn how to fly with certain weather conditions. Otherwise, you'll never get to have that experience of learning. So, I mean, if I was this guy, you know, I didn't look at the weather. I mean, the weather was obviously terrible where he was going, but if he felt like he needed to either, if he felt some requirement to go, or, you know, at least try to go, then, you know, you can always pick a spot halfway, you know, and say, all right, well, the weather there is not looking too great, but the forecast is supposed to change in a couple hours. I'm going to fly to a halfway point where the weather is supposed to be good. I'm going to land, and then I'm going to look at the weather. You know, if it's just, if you have to do it, then at least mitigate it by maybe going to a halfway point.
Right.
I'm like you. I'm the kind of person that just doesn't go. You know?
Well, the other thing, and this is an extremely naive thing to say, and I recognize that, having only been in 3 lessons, but I don't understand how to get disoriented like that. You know, this wasn't an elevation problem, right? This wasn't a situation where there was obstructions or mountains that you weren't aware of if you didn't know where you were. That particular area of Chicago or Illinois is pretty flat. At that point, like my mind would be like, fine, vector me to Milwaukee, wherever that was, and all I'm gonna do is keep my eyes on my speed, my attitude indicator, right, and my turn coordinator. Am I maintaining level flight? Like, just get me out of this. And if I just keep my eyes glued to that, and then if I can see outside, I'll use that to orient myself against the horizon. But how do you just turn your plane into the ground? I guess I just don't understand that.
Here's what I think. And again, this is really speculative, really. But the one thing that's pretty obvious to me is how much stress this guy was in. I mean, he couldn't even, in some of the radio transmissions, he couldn't even speak right. You know what I mean? I wouldn't be surprised if he had an issue. I mean, this is extremely speculative, but I wouldn't be surprised if like he had so much stress that he like blacked out.
Yeah.
You know, like had a heart attack or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Because to your point, he was still under the clouds. I mean, if you believe what the little flight simulator video was, you know, he was still, you know, the clouds weren't like at the ground. They were at 900 feet or something, right? And he could maintain visual contact with the ground. Plus he had flight instruments. So to your point, I mean, doing a spiral is indicative of either I give up or I passed out. You know?
Yeah. It's heartbreaking. I try and put myself in those situations and try and think, what would I do in that situation? And hell, I mean, That's one of those times it's like drop below the cloud cover, risk getting in trouble for that, but get the plane on the ground safely.
Oh yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, when you kind of again, you know, it's I find it tough to do, but if you were to truly go through one of these checklists here in your head, and you're thinking about which decision you're going to make, I mean, to me, if you're really in that kind of stress where you're thinking about just letting your airplane go, I mean, an alternative that I would get to before that point would be to land the airplane on the highway or something. Yeah. You know, like why not put it down in a field? You know, so you'll walk away with a sprained ankle. You know. But yeah, I think the other thing that comes into play in this video, I think this video, the reason I picked it too is it's a good, the other video that we watched last time that I sent to you guys after the class, equally so, was a good video on hazardous attitudes. The last video, remember, the guy took the flight up there in like Montana or Idaho. Mm-hmm. And he had a flight briefer and he had a flight service person on the radio basically tell him that the flight was not recommended.
Yeah, and he kept saying, "Oh, I'm just going to pop in there." It seems like the worst place to check out the weather is in the plane when you're in it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, he's like, "Hey, yeah, I can see 70 miles. You know, I'm gonna pop in there and I'll scoot back out if I can't make it or whatever."
Yeah, I mean, if you're surrounded by the weather, you're not going to be popping back out of anything.
No, and I think right away, and this guy's the same thing. I took a screenshot here of the CFI's statement where the CFI basically said, "Hey, do you know about the weather that you're about to?" I mean, this CFI wasn't even going there, and he knew about the weather, you know. And Mr. Pilot stated that the forecast weather for time of arrival was to be VFR. Well, that either indicates he didn't look at the weather or he's lying. So, you know, the decision to go and risk your life was so important that you would lie to a flight instructor. That says that he probably had one of those hazardous attitudes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and then the last point I think is important. You know, he's more, and the video stated it too. He's more interested in completing the mission, as is, than seeking alternatives. You know, so, and it cost him and his family their lives. It's nuts, unbelievable.
And the girl's boyfriend, his life.
Yeah, yeah. You know, the other thing too, and he just to mention one of the other tools, he definitely didn't write down the 5 Ps because if he had an acute awareness of the SR-20's capabilities, he could have essentially plugged in one of those airports and the airplane would fly itself. I mean, that thing's got one of the most advanced autopilots in general aviation.
That's crazy. That's one thing I've used our simple little KLN 89B GPS device to get me to an airport. It tells me distance and heading. All I have to do is fly it.
That's right. Yeah, this thing right here, you plug in the airport that the air traffic controller gave him, the PWK, hit direct, hit your autopilot, and then you can load an approach, and the plane will actually it'll get to within 30 feet of landing. It'll almost land the airplane.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so I think they said he had like 500 hours. I mean, how do you have that many hours and not know the capability of your airplane?
I don't know. How would you have not, like, I would have had to have done that just to see it work.
Oh yeah, just like, see how cool.
Tech geek and you'd be like, all right, let's see if this thing can do it, you know? And like I would, you know, I've already downloaded the manual for that little GPS one just because I want to understand how to work it beyond what I've learned already.
Yeah. No, that's right, man. It could save your life. It really could. Like, if you think about it, you could get into a sticky situation, and the air traffic controller, all they're going to do, you know, they'll be able to give you headings and weather, and then it's up to you to get there. But if your plane will do it for you, I mean, you know, might as well.
Agreed. it's heartbreaking, but like you said, the most valuable thing we can do for that situation is learn from it.
Yeah, right. So, and then just a couple other notes here. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think of a good example, but I've scrapped flights because of weather, and even instrument rated. There'll be flights that you don't take because it's just the weather's just too bad. It just doesn't make sense. So, and then and so that's what I got. I guess we ended a little bit early. I kind of went through those charts a little quickly.
Oh, that's okay. That was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So any questions on this stuff? I mean, I'll be honest with you. You kind of have to pick your own method of getting through the flow chart, and of course the examiner is going to want to hear you talk about some of these tools and how you would use them. But I think a pilot like yourself is going to find your own way, and I think you know what I mean by that, right? You're going to find a method that makes sense for you.
No, yeah, I definitely plan to study that. The slide number 8, I really liked how it sort of distilled sort of the workflow into it. So I think that's something I'm going to try and get familiar with, just thinking about it from that process.
Yeah, I think the one thing that the textbook, just to be careful with, the one thing the textbook doesn't do a very good job of doing is, it explains the tools kind of separately, but really, the 3P model is the risk management model, and then the checklists, these individual checklists here, the PAVE, the CARE, and the TEAM, are individual steps of the 3P model. And,
right.
and unless I think the textbook probably could do a little bit better job of explaining that.
So one of the things so like I said, I'm doing this King School online thing as well. And it has a library of things, and one of them was 3 flyers that talk about those and the 3 Ps and whatnot, and when to, like, sort of how they're used together. Perceive, you typically will use PAVE. For process, you'll typically use CARE, and for risk management, you'll use TEAM. That's how this, front and back flyer they have 3 of them. One for daytime VFR, or like local VFR flying, one for night VFR flying, and then one for VFR cross-country flying.
Okay, that's pretty good.
They're documents, so it's not like it's private to this class. But I printed them out and put them in plastic sleeves, and I keep them in my notebook that I take with me on the plane.
Yeah, shoot it over to me. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, I can do that.
Cool, man. So. Cool. Well, any questions? Any questions on this or any of the other material you've been going through?
I will have questions, but not just yet. I need to go back, and weather theory is still something I need to get more comfortable with. I was going through some of those. Maybe we can spend a few minutes talking about those questions.
Yeah. Pull it up here. Okay.
I could self-help through the answers, but like 3383, the temperature inversion would most likely result in which weather condition? So I know what a temperature inversion is, but I don't know what condition it's likely to do. And this is how some of the other questions I've asked you, like, well, if I could think about the theory of it, I can probably get to the answer. I guess I don't know the theory of that yet, other than trying to understand sort of hot air versus cold air versus humidity, or the dew point, and whether that's going to, create clouds or rain.
Yeah.
So that's how I try to approach the question, but
well, it's a good way to approach it, because, to be honest with you, I mean, even though you can memorize these questions and answers as one way to do it, in application, understanding the theory is really going to help, right?
I don't want to know the theory. I don't want to memorize the question.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. So
before I was just trying to get it, you're like, well, no, just understand the theory, and then, because when it happens in real life, it won't be in question form.
No, for sure. No, when you're doing your flight planning stuff, it's not going to be. It's going to be all you, like what you know, right?
Well, even if you're in the plane and something like that happens, it's not this example, but anything. It's like, okay, well, suddenly I'm faced with the problem I have to solve, and it's not an ABC multiple choice situation. I need to understand the theory of what's going on around me so that I can correctly get to a solution.
Right. So, so temperature inversions. So what the FAA wants you to understand with the temperature inversion, and what's important to know is obviously the temperature inversion. What it is, it's your lapse rate is not typical, right? You've got more of an increase in temperature with altitude, right? But this actually, the way they present this question is kind of a trick question. At least I think they probably catch a lot of people on this. So they say a temperature inversion would most likely result in which weather condition? And immediately your eyes go down to this right here. An increase in temperature as altitude is increased, right? Because that's what a temperature inversion is.
But that's not a weather condition.
Right. That's not a result. That's just what it is, right?
I knew it wasn't C.
Right, exactly. So now we've got that eliminated.
Let me tell you what I did guess. Which number on that one?
Yeah.
3383. Just so you can, if I got it wrong, you can include some explanation in your answer. I said B. So continue. I just want you to know that I went with B.
Well, yeah. So and here's why I think I agree with you, because let me get to it. I need to kind of draw it here.
That's fine.
I need to draw the theory, so to speak. So when we are, if this is the ground, okay. Oh my gosh.
It's okay. You're using a mouse. I get
it. And I've got a parcel of air. So here's just my random parcel of air, okay? And let's just say, for the sake of the example, it's an unstable parcel, okay? So it's unstable. So we know, you know, from other theory that if you've got an unstable air mass, if that air mass is lifted and there's enough moisture, then you might have thunderstorm conditions, right?
Because those are the three things that are required.
Exactly. So you've got this air mass here, and let's say, just for sake of argument, it's at, I'm just gonna make a number up, it's at 75 degrees, okay? And it's unstable, and so for us to get thunderstorms, something's gonna have to lift it. Well, okay, here is scenario 1 and here's scenario 2. So in scenario 1, I'm gonna say that the atmosphere is also generally unstable, and it's got a convective lapse rate. So it's got a 4.4 degree Fahrenheit with 1,000 foot, right?
Yep.
So that parcel of air is going to start, because this is 75 degrees, and at this altitude increment, the atmosphere is at 71, and here it's at 67, and so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is hot air? What does it want to do?
Rise.
Yes. So this parcel of air is gonna rise, and it's going to, as it rises, it's going to cool, right? But depending on the lapse rate, depending on how aggressive the lapse rate is, it might actually have to get pretty high to get to a spot where it's going to cool. Oh, and by the way, the cycle continues, right? So it gets replaced. This air gets replaced with air that's up here. So this air comes down and replaces it, and the cycle, it's a never-ending cycle, right?
Right.
So over time, over several hours, you have this huge cumulonimbus cloud, right? And you've got thunderstorm conditions. In a temperature inversion, so here we've got our parcel of air, and we'll say it's unstable again. Stable or unstable, the point I want to make is it doesn't really matter whether your little parcel of air is unstable or stable in a temperature, regardless of your lapse rate, right? So 75 degrees, and then we've got a low level temperature inversion. So here's maybe like 5,000 feet. And between ground level and 5,000 feet, we actually have an increase in temperature. So maybe this is 77, maybe this is 79, maybe this is 82. And then above here, it starts going down, so the temperature starts decreasing. Maybe it's, 70 up here, so on and so forth. Well, this parcel of air, it's warm, so it wants to rise. But the problem is it's not going to rise that much because it hits a layer of air that's warmer than it is. So it's going to get to the, 75, it's going to get to 77. And 77 is going to say, no, I'm not going to let you go up anymore because I'm warmer.
Okay.
Make sense?
It does.
Yeah. So your parcel of air is going to lift, and this is I should have used better temperatures. You know, maybe this was 78. Let's use 78 here. So this is actually going to lift up to the 77 point, but it's not going to go any higher. It's not going to go to the 79 point because it can't, you know, warm air rises. It's not going to go any warmer than the level in the atmosphere when it meets that temperature.
Okay.
So the point being, in a temperature inversion, you're going to have relatively stable air. You know, even if it starts off as unstable, it's going to stabilize, and it's not going to be able to rise higher than the temperature level at which it's at. Unlike the convective example, where you've got your parcel of air rising and rising and rising and rising until it hits a certain temperature level, the temperature inversion will not let that parcel of air rise because it's actually warmer than that parcel of air.
Got it.
Okay, so if I go back and look at the answers, yeah, I mean, I'd pick B based on that. I don't think I'd pick A. I haven't looked at the answer, am I right?
I haven't looked either. Right.
Let's look.
What? Are you serious?
Wow.
Oh, this is where the what-if stuff is so tricky.
Yeah. Well, hey, you know what though? The theory, we didn't screw the theory up.
Yeah.
So, you know, answer A. So an increase in define inversion of the ground. Air in contact with the ground becomes cold while temperatures increases height. Okay. So I mean, so here's where I screwed up, right? What they want you to get away from this is that a temperature inversion results in poor visibility. I didn't even really. I mean, I was looking at it more from the vertical development perspective. So answer A is incorrect because temperature will not result in vertical development since warm air will not rise if the air above is warmer. So that's kind of how I approach that.
Okay.
Yeah. But I guess they bring up a good point. Yeah, poor visibility. Yeah. So here I am thinking it's a trick question because that's not really a result of, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's where I got thrown off too. It's like, well, that's what it is. I wouldn't know if it possibly has a weather condition, but okay. Let's do another one if we got a minute or two.
Yeah, man.
So 3407. I think that where I struggled on this one was just trying to remember which clouds are. Yeah, I can remember the thunderstorm cloud, like the towering cumulonimbus, but I can remember when like stratus is good or bad or.
Yeah. So you want to remember stratus clouds are most often associated with stable.
Okay.
Stable pockets of air, stable air mass. And whenever they pose a question to you and tell you that an air mass is being forced upward and it's an unstable, then you want to think thunderstorms.
Right.
And that in this case would be C, clouds with considerable vertical development and associated turbulence.
That's the one I guessed.
Yeah.
There's one more that had to do with rain. Where was it? Just a second. Oh, yeah. 3424 is first page, second column, fourth question down.
Yep.
Steady precipitation preceding a front as an indication of it. Only I could remember when I was looking at this question is stuff that preceded the front or the squalls.
Right.
So I got hung up with this because I couldn't, like, I remember that a front, depending on the type of front, is pushing at different rates.
Yeah. That's kind of, to me, that's kind of a trick question because in my mind, warm front precipitation typically doesn't precede the front, But the key term that they want you to look at here is steady precipitation.
Which suggests that it's stable?
Yes. Yeah, which being the opposite of showery precipitation. This steady precipitation is like your rainy day. You know, you wake up, it's raining, it rains all day, it's gray outside, it just rains, right?
Right.
We don't. What's tricky? What kind of is interesting? We don't get a lot of that in Texas. We get a lot of the opposite, like thunderstorms and like squall lines.
Yep.
Yep. And so anytime you see the steady precipitation, that's an indicator of rainy day, non-showery type precipitation phenomenon. And so because of that, because it's not showers, cumuliform clouds is out of the question, because cumuliform clouds are only associated with like showers, thunderstorms, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So then it's got to be one of the stratiform answers. And I really don't think the front information gives you, I think they just put that in there to confuse you. I don't think that gives you any information. But stratiform clouds are typically not associated with turbulence.
Okay.
Ever. So I'm going to have to say it's C. Stratiform clouds with little or no turbulence.
Okay. What did I guess? 34, 24. I guess C.
Yeah, you'd be right. Yeah, it's precipitation from stratiform clouds is usually steady and there's little or no turbulence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the thing I want to get away from is guessing and get to knowing. So this was helpful.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. Whenever there's a couple key indicators, it's not, and it's not just to pass the test necessarily. It's definitely in application too. But anytime, anytime you've got unstable air mass, you're going to have cumuliform clouds. Anytime you have a stable air mass, you're going to have stratiform or some other cirrus type clouds. Anytime, you know, cumuliform clouds are always associated with turbulence. Stratiform clouds are typically not. And then from a precipitation standpoint, rain showers are associated with cumuliform and turbulence, and steady is associated with stratiform and not turbulent.
Okay.
Yep. And then loosely, you could loosely say that cold fronts are associated with the turbulent cumuliform thunderstorms, and warm fronts are associated with the stratiform, steady precipitation, no turbulence.
Okay, so say it again. Cold front.
Yeah, cold front. You can loosely. This is definitely not a rule. It's more of a typical, but
right.
Yeah. So when I'm grouping these up, I'm doing, and I just got to write it out. I'm doing cold front generally is cumuliform, rain showers, and good visibility, and turbulence, and thunderstorms, typically. Now, it's not the rule, but typically, especially here in Texas, it's very typically.
Right.
Warm front, stratiform, clouds, steady precip, poor visibility, no turbulence, no thunderstorms. Now, back to my comment about it, you know, being typical, not the rule. Even if, like, let's say you've got thunderstorms, you know, with cumuliform clouds on a warm front, these kind of weather conditions always stick together. So, you know, regardless of frontal activity, these always stick together. If you've got cumuliform clouds, these are the weather conditions you're going to have.
Okay.
And you know, there's no mixing. You're never going to find stratiform clouds with turbulence and rain showers. It's one or the other.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, that, like I said, I like to call this my rainy day. And this is, you know, this up here is a good classification of your violent thunderstorm day.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And that's kind of what I'm looking for here with some of these questions is sort of, are there some general frameworks that I can operate within that aren't the, you know, the whole truth line all the times, but can, you know, give you a starting point of how to analyze?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And I didn't throw a lot of those questions in here. I threw one in, I think. Let's see, did I fly any others?
Where do you get these questions, by the way?
So I purchased the ASA private pilot test prep book that has all these questions in it.
Nice. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Similar to probably what you've got with Sporties.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I went looking for these at one point. Just I was curious what was available, but I did find the ASA one. But
yeah,
I didn't buy it.
Is Sporties, are you getting the same thing out of Sporties though with the numbers?
I haven't gone through Sporties in a while, but yes, the questions are generally the same and they come with explanations. There's 800 something questions, I think, total. Mm-hmm. That's grouped by category.
Yeah. Here's another question that it kind of goes back to that what you were saying with, you know, frameworks. What the 3420, what cloud types would indicate convective turbulence? So, you know, going back to here, that would be our violent thunderstorm, you know, so it's going to be cumuliform. So, you know, the only answer here that makes sense is towering cumulus clouds. Nimbostratus and cirrus are down here in the rainy day. No turbulent type activity.
Yeah, I actually got that one right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but that, yeah, just to comment on it, there are general frameworks when it comes to different air mass, you know, qualities.
Right. Okay. Cool, man. That was helpful.
Good. Good. All right, man. Well, any other questions or?
I'm gonna go back through the answers and just study them a little bit, and if I don't get anything, I'll circle back with you and ping you if any of them were confusing.
Sounds like a plan.
But yeah, cool.
All right, man. Sounds good. I'm gonna look at the calendar, maybe throw a few dates to you for a visit and see what your guys' calendar looks like.
Yeah, sounds good. I'd say October's off limits because of Sarah, but other than that, we're around.
Sounds like a plan, dude.
Cool.
All right, man. We'll talk later.
Sounds good. Have a good one.
See ya.